Generations. Why do we categorize and label them? To distinguish them from each other. And what is the criteria that we use to differentiate them? Is it age? Not entirely. Mindsets? Yes, mindsets. The mindsets with which each of the generations lead their lives. Take me for example. I am a Gen Z guy. But the moment I say, I love typewriters and Polaroids, or I'm not so big on social media, or that I enjoy orchestral music, all of which is true by the way, I, despite my age, become a guy from a generation older than my own. With that being said, allow me to draw your attention to the mindsets of various generations towards life and death. To support my realizations, I conducted a survey. I encourage you all to take the survey yourselves and compare your opinions with the results as we move along. To begin with, I got them to enter their age. Because age is also a criteria used to differentiate generations to an extent. Then, I asked them for their opinion regarding the afterlife, heaven, hell, etc. And lastly, I made them react to a particular situation. As the results came in, two observations were made. The first observation I made was that when asked about their opinion regarding the afterlife, most of the people below 30 chose no or maybe, and the ones above 30 chose yes or maybe. The second observation I made was that most of the people who chose no or maybe said that they would panic in the given situation or would react sorrowfully. And the ones who chose yes or maybe said that they would either react sorrowfully or that it would have no effect on them at all. So the general conclusion was that the older generation believes in the afterlife and isn't afraid of dying, while the newer generation doesn't believe in the afterlife and is somewhat afraid of dying. The motive behind conducting this survey was also to connect it to a personal experience of mine. This one is from back when I was in 10th grade. It was just another morning. I was in the shower, taking a shower like anyone would, when suddenly a thought crossed my mind. Now I'm pretty sure you all know what shower thoughts are capable of. Anyway, the thought in question was, and I quote, "Everyone is born with a terminal disease, and it's called aging." I was fascinated by the depth of the thought, and so naturally I dug into it. But before we continue, there are two things about me that I would like you all to know. One, I'm somewhat an overthinker myself. And two, I identify as an atheist, meaning I don't believe in the terms like God and the afterlife. Along the same lines, there is this well-known quote that I would like to share. It goes, "People fear what they don't understand." Now, if you're able to connect the dots, you'll see where I'm headed with this. Rewinding to my shower thought, as I dug in deeper, follow-up thoughts came gushing into my mind. I imagined myself old, on my deathbed, wondering how I could just drift out of existence any moment. I imagined the earth exploding, and much more. But we better not get into the specifics. Essentially, I started imagining all the worst case scenarios that could happen in life, all of which somehow resulting in my imminent death. Basically, death was the recurring theme of my thoughts that day. Clearly, these series of events overwhelmed me. I tried getting rid of the thoughts, but I couldn't. I started to panic, and eventually, I had a panic attack. Thankfully, I was soon able to snap out of it. I thought that this situation was now in the past for good, but I was wrong. The aftermath was even worse. I had days where I couldn't sit still and focus. I had sleepless nights because silence sounded dreadful to me. This lasted for about a month, and finally things started going back to normal. Lucky me, right? Nope. I had another episode in 11th grade, and this time it was even worse. The symptoms were the same, but of higher intensities. No matter what I did, the thoughts would resurface. I had to do something, or things would have gotten completely out of control. And so, I started creating and implementing various remedies, and out of all those, two worked wonders for me. The first one was distractions. Oh, I'm aware it's an obvious one. How did I not think of it earlier? Trust me, I did. I used it during the first episode, but I got carried away and it cost me my grades. So I wanted to keep it as a last resort for future encounters. Second one was sharing. I realized that the more I shared this problem of mine with other people, the better it felt. I was, in a sense, embracing this problem of mine. I wore it proudly. I'd bring it up randomly in between conversations. I'd be like, hey, by the way, you know what? I have thanatophobia. Yup, that's what it's called. Thanatophobia, or simply put, death anxiety. I found that out through the internet. By now, I'm sure you must have a rough idea of what thanatophobia is, so I'll directly jump into the statistics. According to a survey conducted in the US in 2017, I quote, 20.3% Americans are afraid or very afraid of dying. Scaling this to a global level, even if I assume that only 5% of the world population feels the same, that's still about 400 million people. Let that sink in. Now, before I go any further, I would like to make two things certain. First, having thoughts about death or dying is very common. Almost everyone has had a thought about it at some point in their lives. Some of you must have had it, some of you will have it in the future. Second, thanatophobia is different from that. It occurs when these thoughts stick around and start bothering you a lot, thus making you anxious. It mostly occurs in adolescents and young adults. I think you can make out why it is important for me to address it now. And that's my sole objective, to share my struggle and fight with death anxiety in an attempt to potentially help others who are suffering through the same. I have put forth a problem, and I cannot possibly leave without proposing a solution. Naturally, in a situation like this, any person would try and look it up on Google, hoping to find a solution. I did that too. But the results that come up on Google are nearly useless. Things like try and meditate, brainwash your mind, attend therapy, and this and that. Therapy sounds good, but it isn't as accessible as it seems. While it may work for some, it is expensive and doesn't guarantee results. But what can I say? To each its own, right? Nonetheless, here are two solutions that might prove to be worlds better than the ones Google suggests, because they surely did for me. Number one, look for something that keeps you occupied. Your hobbies, for instance. For me, it was reading books, watching movies and shows, and listening to music. Yours might be different, but as banal as it sounds, it really does help in its own mysterious ways. If it still persists, there's always a plan B. Number two, sharing. Don't keep it to yourself. Don't bottle up what you feel. Share it with the others and you'll feel like a heavy burden has been lifted off of you. I do have to tell you though, these solutions do not provide instant results. They take time, but they are very effective. There is one additional benefit that I yielded from these, further increasing their credibility by many folds. After watching a lot of movies and shows, I grew high interest in the art of making them. I might not have taken any significant step towards it yet, but it established a foundation of a newfound interest. Maybe you'll too get lucky and find new curiosities of your own. Like I said earlier, having thoughts about death is common. Everyone experiences it at some point in their lives. It is not something you should be ashamed of and certainly isn't something that you should suppress. The actual problem lies in the fact that people don't know about it. 3 in 4 people who took my survey weren't familiar with the term thanatophobia. It is the lack of awareness regarding this subject that needs to be addressed. Solely because as I talk and you listen, in some corner of the world, there is someone who's feeling helpless and is absolutely losing it over a rather trivial matter because the thought of one's own death just dawned upon them and there's no one to help them. Because how can there be help when the problem itself hasn't been diagnosed? You can't treat a wound without having identified it first, can you? Remember the world numbers I talked about earlier? The graph of that is an increasing one, and the slope of which is dangerously steep. It is about time we stop labeling thanatophobia as a bunch of mere situations one just simply overthought. We need to identify thanatophobia as a legit fear and start working towards finding ways to overcome the same. Why not just embrace the shower thought and deliberately ease our way into living with it? Thank you.